Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today we're going to go through the EIA data, which on the whole was relatively bearish, and we'll go through why we think that's the case, really kind of going through the different stages of the overview, refined products, and then looking at exports and a little bit on the international side. We're going to start to try to roll this up and to try to tie this back to the econ show, and then we just launched the OPEC show this morning just to kind of show how all of this is really interconnected, and we're starting to see a lot of these things, in terms of breaking down with a lot of these demand levels. So just jumping right in, and we're going to talk with you now about crude oil, and now we're going to look at it with the SPR and without the SPR, just because we're starting to get towards the end of some of these draws from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So here you can see that we had a build. The build, including the SPR, because there was a little bit of a draw out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, was 1.73 million barrels. Now, when we talked last time about the hurricane and things adjusting, we're starting to see a little bit of a normalization across really stock builds. And again, when we look at production, the thing that is lasting the longest is really the refinery runs, which we'll talk about in a minute, which remain down because two facilities experienced some extensive damage. One of them within the facility, and then the other is more power related, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the one thing that we really want to look at is when we look at Pad 3 in terms of the builds that are really starting to increase, and we'll see increase even more as additional production comes online from the Gulf of Mexico, and we head into that shoulder season, which I know is our favorite term. Now that we're past Labor Day, we're now firmly into the start of the shoulder season. So when we look at crude production, we see that it was up 300,000 barrels. Based on just facilities coming back online in the Gulf of Mexico, we're seeing more activity happening on within the lower 48, as we talk about on the Primary Vision Frac Spread Count shows. You can see that we should see about another million barrels come on really this week, and we should see that catch up as we're already back to about 10.9, 11 million, and we should get to about 11.1, 11.3. So we will see additional production, which will mostly show up in either Cushing and or Pad 3. Now, just to touch on the refiners for a moment, we have Port Arthur on the Texas Gulf Coast, which was shut ahead of Laura. That's coming back with some up and running by late next week. So that's going to be something that's going to come online. And Citgo actually came out and declared force majeure just because they're down. They'll remain down for the next 3 to 4 weeks. So we should see this disruption really on about 225,000 for Totals Port Arthur, about 425,000 for Citgo. So when you look at it on the aggregate, we're sitting there watching about 700,000 barrels that won't be coming back relatively quickly. Now, when we turn to the oil total inventory, this one's going to include the SPR. So here you can see things have normalized. We started to get a build, which again, we start to see some more builds as we go through. But based on the disruption between refinery throughput and the lack of production, we should have seen a much bigger drawdown in the product space, and we didn't, which is why we can say that this was a relatively bearish report, because without these big drawdowns in the products, it just shows how the demand really remains the struggle here. So now that we've seen the SPR really kind of normalize a bit, and now it's really being held more for just that strategic reason, we can go back to the commercial stock. Now, there's still a little bit left in there, so we're going to be watching this, and we'll post it as it's relevant, but we're going to start looking at it from the perspective of just the commercial stocks now that things have normalized a bit. And you can see we're now back over 500 million barrels in just crude oil inventory, excluding the SPR. You can see we still remain at seasonally adjusted all-time highs and we're moving in the wrong direction. Typically, you want to continue to see a little bit of a drawdown as we go through September, but instead we're seeing the opposite. And it's really driven because, the hurricane is still an issue. But when you look at it, we have more production coming back online. We still have refiners that are down because of the storm, and then down just due to demand reasons where margins just aren't there. So that's going to continue to weigh which is going to weigh on pricing across the whole complex. But it's also going to weigh on refiners themselves, because now they're going to have to reduce runs, which will put more crude in storage. And that's when we start to look at pad 3, and we really want to continue to highlight the fact that we're still at seasonally adjusted all-time highs, and we're starting to see that grind higher. And as you have more production coming back online through this week, as we've already seen, this is only really going to get worse. So now when we start to dig in a little bit more on the imports, you can see that imports normalized a bit. They were up about 524,000 barrels a day, driven by pad 3 and pad 5. Now, pad 5 is going to cause some problems when you look at driving demand, as many people within the Primary Vision family live in California and decided to park themselves in the middle of a desert. They are experiencing some severe just fires that are just raging across. So travel is diminished, not only because of just safety reasons, but also just driving in general, now that we're past Labor Day. So you're going to see that also weigh on some of these runs within pad 5 and where that demand is. But in the meantime, you still have floating storage out there, which is going to have to come on shore. Now, pad 3 is going to be another one where we're starting to see those imports normalize. Again, it's still down. Saudi Arabia's was still at a near all-time low for Saudi imports. Those imports will remain under pressure, but we will start to see some normalization, especially as the pricing has come down. We talked about in the OPEC show, we had OSPs coming down, which is going to help try to drive some of that additional flow into the U.S. On a runs level, you can see that we were down about 5%. We had a full utilization of about 71.8% across the whole complex. And you can see pad 3 was really the driver behind that. Now, some of that will come back. We will see some of that. But again, there were some assets that were coming down ahead of Hurricane Laura, not just because of the hurricane itself for protective reasons, but also because of demand. So even though we have about 700,000 barrels that's down due to damage, there's still about 300,000 that's down just because of demand reasons, which won't be coming back. So we will see some of this return, but not to the levels that we've been at. And we start to go into our demand cycle where we're in the shoulder season. So we already know that there's facilities that won't be coming back on, which is going to not really push us too far below 70%. We think that right now we're going to get a little bit of a bounce here. We should get back to about 72, 73%. But again, we're not really going to crawl back up to that 80. It's more going to be between 67 and 75 as we go through the shoulder period. And then implied demand started to normalize, specifically in gasoline, because again, timing delays between Labor Day when everything is pushed into the market. And by pushed into the market, you have to consider we're looking at this from the perspective of storage. What is in storage getting moved to the blender and then to the pumping station, to the actual gas station and the pump itself. So here you have some movement through the system in order to get it to the pump and to the rack. But even when we factor this in, we still had a demand loss, which is going to be a problem because we should have seen a big demand increase, which we'll talk about in the next segment. And then distillate, again, is just kind of going back and forth, which is going to be a problem. The bigger thing is that we're seeing more talk about oil traders trying to find U.S. onshore storage. We're starting to see some of these movements, and you're going to have to see contango start to price in a little bit, which is why we've seen the front month come down versus the curve, which is something that we're going to talk about in our insights that come out this week. So just looking at floating storage is back to the 5-year average. We don't really see any reason why it's not going to continue to kind of track that average overall. We do have some additional crude in transit, which will then parked in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, the problem is we have the pad 3 utilization rates remaining low, which is going to put just more crude on the water, which is going to result in this really kind of tracking that 5-year average, but really nothing too exciting one way or the other. And it really is reflected in the import data. You can see that the imports bounced, But again, we're because PADD 3 runs are going to remain well off, not just the 5-year, but just on a historic level, are going to remain at lows. You're going to see imports react the same way just because they don't need the same crude coming in off the water. You may see them try to take advantage of some pricing benefits, especially with OSP cuts, as we see competition and they can get some decent pricing. But again, it's just going to be marrying that, which is why we're going to remain at these lows. Now, just before we get into the next segment, we just look at the U.S. product supply. Looking at the demand level across the board, you can see that we really started to flatten out. And we talked about this overall, where we've seen these issues where we're just not going to get back to those 2019, 2018 levels. Instead, we've hit that plateau, which is what we're going to talk about. We go through in the Econ show, looking at those mobility data points, those high frequency data points, why there's pressure. And we see it again. Like that's why we've seen we have the fall, which we expected last week, and now we're going to continue to kind of suck around, and that average is going to kind of roll over. And we just think it moves sideways with a slight downward trajectory, driven by the loss of gasoline, as distillate and jet fuel just kind of struggle to hold their own. So in the next segment, we're going to go through in a bit more detail on gasoline and really kind of break out what does it mean, what is pricing going to do, and then what do we expect going forward as we traverse the shoulder season.